Familiar voice. Right, it's bang on 7 o'clock. I think we should begin. If others turn up, that will be good. So, I'll stand. Oh, here. That's it. Right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to St. George's Talks. My name is Rick Jones. I am the chair of the committee that looks after this historic building. And generally, I begin this event with a line of German in honor of the people that used to worship here. So, Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren, und willkommen bei St. Georg's Gespräche. There we are. It links us with the past. This wonderful ancient building, 1762, was built by a community of German migrant workers who came to London. Their skill chiefly was sugar refining, Zuckerbäcker they were, and they built this building for their worship in the Lutheran tradition, an ancient German Lutheran church, which had a congregation until the 1990s. Now, although there is actually another Lutheran church worshipping in it today, it's chiefly used as a venue for talks, sometimes film locations, wedding receptions, and various other uses that we as a committee attempt to find for it. The themes of the monthly talks, which take place every third Tuesday through the year, almost monthly, are either German culture and history or the local community. Our speaker this evening is actually two people. The one, an ex-detective inspector with the Met Police, who has turned later in life to taking a law degree and is now a book writer. Researching him, I discovered that based at the Abbey Road police station, he would habitually tell Beatles fans in search of their heroes that Paul McCartney did actually live in Abbey Road in order to save him being pestered by them at his real address. So a certain looseness with the truth by this former BBC detective inspector. And he is joined by a former BBC journalist who was at one time Sony Radio's Journalist of the Year, 1996, for his reporting on the war crimes tribunals. And he covered those of Rwanda and Yugoslavia, specifically the trials of Slobodan Milosevic and Charles Taylor. He, in later life, has turned to being an academic by profession and is now the Emeritus Professor of Media and Criminal Justice at the University of Bedfordshire. I did also discover in my researches that they have something else in common, and that is playing careers in football. The one for the Met Police 11 and the other for the third 11 at Selwyn College, Cambridge. I presume that they know that they have that in common too. So Will you welcome now, please, our speakers this evening, Bob Sherwood and Jon Silverman.
Which is this button there, isn't it? No, Jon. Yep. You know what? Thank you very much for that, Rick. Slightly inaccurate. Abbey Road doesn't have a police station. It was St John's Wood.
Oh.
I know where that came from. That came from LinkedIn. I know. However, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much indeed for inviting us to this lovely church in Whitechapel in East London. I am an East Ender by birth, but sadly moved away from the area when I was 13. That's all right. I thought it was me. And I don't get back here often enough, but I do watch Call the Midwife, which does remind me a bit of my younger days living in the East End. That's done at Chatham, isn't it? But it just brings me back. Anyway, I also must thank Rick, Annette, and Cameron. Annette and I go back several years. I mentor her for a PhD, which she's swimmingly going to get easily. She's going on very nicely. So thank you all very much for having us here. The book came together for two factors. As Rick stole a bit of my thunder, that yes, I was a technical inspector of the Metropolitan Police. I did a law degree whilst I was in the police, and then 2012 went back to university to Royal Holloway College, near where I live, to do Holocaust studies. The opportunity came my way and I did it. And I did my dissertation, which you have to do at the end of a master's. Those of you who've been to university would appreciate that. And I did it comparing the war crimes team of the Great Britain, United Kingdom, to that of the United States. And for my absolute horror and amazement, I got a distinction for that and was invited to do a PhD, which I did on the United Kingdom war crimes team in relation to World War II. From 3 O-levels at grammar school, well, that was quite an achievement, really. So I was quite chuffed at that. And I finished that in 2020. So I was 65, 66. Yeah, shows how old I am now when I did it, which I thought was quite an achievement. I'm quite proud of that. Jon, as Rick pointed out, has come from a totally different direction. But during my research, I met Jon and he was extremely helpful. And at the end of the PhD process, we discussed issues and he invited me with him to write a book, which he actually wrote, and the research on it was mine. So together we put this together. Right, okay. I think it's fair to say that at the end of Second World War, I am possibly, well, wasn't like that, but people think about the war crimes team of the Second World War, the Nuremberg trials, and to a lesser degree, the Belsen trials. These guys being really on the ball, tenacious, keen, well-trained, etc. That's not the case at all. I thought that was the case, and many others did. It wasn't that at all. The Nuremberg trials, correctly known as the International Military Tribunal, which took place from November 1945 until October 1946. That's 11 months with 24 defendants. The Belsen trial, which was the British gig, that took place and it took over 2 months and with 44 defendants. I think you can see the balance there, can't you? The International Military Tribunal had no female defendants at all, whereas the Belsen trial had 15 female defendants. I think it's right to say that the British at the end of the Second World War were looking to get back to peace and get back to normality as soon as possible. Right. The guys who became war crimes investigators in the Second World War came from a variety of backgrounds. Now, the Royal Military Police, they were trained initially by the Metropolitan Police at the beginning of the Second World War, and a number of very experienced detective sergeants became sergeants in the Royal Military Police. And you'd have thought, when it came to the discovery of Belsen, which was on the 15th of April, 1945, these guys with their experience and knowledge would have gone in and taken statements, taken statements and got the ball wrong. That wasn't the case at all. It was totally unexpected discovering Belsen. And they really didn't know what to do. So a war crimes team, a leader was appointed, a guy called Barraclough, John Barraclough. He didn't have much of an idea what to do. And he based himself in Brussels, didn't come anywhere near Belsen at all. And on the 18th of May, the guy who was going to lead the inquiry. Okay, sorry. The guy who was ordered, produced to lead the inquiry was a guy by the name of Leo Jen, who was an actor. Some of you may well remember him in post-war movies such as Quo Vadis, and I think he was in The Wooden Horse as well. He was an actor, but prior to, he was also a barrister as well. And he arrived on the scene on the 18th of May, which is over a month after the trial had been completed, which is a long, long time. In police work, the first hour, the first day is very, very important, because after a month or so, a lot of the victims or witnesses gone, disappeared, and they didn't have an idea who was there, so they lost an awful lot of evidence. And I don't think he had his heart and soul in it, because when he was there, I found his memoirs and his papers, which were in a museum in the Midlands, after some boxes, nothing more than that. He had arranged for other thespians, John Gilgood was one of them, to come, and Edith Evans as well, to come to the camp where they had their base to do plays which he'd written. He had dinners, and he created the menus, and all this in his files, in his papers, and he would draw limericks of all the members of staff or all these men and give them nicknames, and he called them the Crime Club, and he had this menu written out. He did all this himself, and even after the trial on the 10th of December, some of the executions took place. They had a dinner that night to celebrate it, and had an effigy of one of the camp female guards called Irma Grisa, who some of you may know of, hanging from an effigy from the gallows. It was a bit crass. And at the end of when the work was over, he was then posted to go and work with the SAS on some of their trials, and they told him to clear off. They didn't want him anymore. Not to me, that wasn't really, as an investigator, I had been involved in investigating a lot of major crimes. That was not the way of doing it. And the police weren't used at all. The guys they got together, there was a guy named Gravel Jenner, who features in this later on. He was sitting in a canteen in London, having his grub just after the war, and a mate of his said, "Oh, do you fancy being in the war crimes team, Gravel?" "Oh, don't know about this." He said, "I don't speak German." "You're Jewish, aren't you?" He said, "Yeah, but so what? You know, I don't speak German. I was born here. I'm as English as you are." "No, you'll do." So they sent him on a course for 2 weeks to learn how to speak German, and away he went. More about him later. And then there was another captain as well, Captain Linton, who got posted there to the day he died. Didn't know why. And then there was Captain Alexander, who again was posted there as an interpreter, because these guys the latter two were German speaking, had been born in Germany. And he got posted there as interpreter. And he was the guy who actually arrested Rudolf Hess, who was the commandant from Auschwitz. There's a lot on that, with a couple of movies out recently, isn't there? The Commandant Shadow and so on and so forth. The thing all these three had in common, which is pertinent, they're all Jewish. Two of them had been in the Isle of Man. As you probably realise, at the beginning of war, internment took place. We discussed that earlier, weren't we? The internment took place at the Isle of Man, and they realised after, well, these guys are on our side. They're not really, they want to help. So they sent them the Pioneer Corps, which meant digging ditches and so on and so forth. And a lot of them sort of progressed on. Alexander was a banker. He'd been there 10 years. You know, he was a banker. So he's an educated, articulate man. He got commissioned and he became interpreter. And he went and found Rudolf Hess. How he found him is another story. It's in the book. Okay. So that's what they had. The Belsen trial, as to say, they got, I think, 15 acquittals and 45, and 11 of them were executed. Right, okay, on the next stage as well. How are we doing for time? Yeah, fine. Okay, right. At the end of the Belsen trial, Nuremberg took place afterwards, and there was other trials as well. It'd be fair to say that the war crimes trials and the war crimes team did do some good work, and over 350 people were charged with criminal offences, a number of whom were convicted. So they did better than they caught, but there wasn't really a feeling for it. The world changed very rapidly at the end of the war. It was costly. It was time-consuming. Guys wanted to get back to City Street. And the major reason why the war crimes thing died out was that Russia was by far, Soviet Union as it were, was fast becoming the enemy, fast becoming the people to watch out for. Germany was stuck in the middle. The Marshall Plan had gone into place, and we needed them to help us suppress Russia should they come across the border, which is very pertinent now, if you wish. And that was one of the reasons. And even Winston Churchill said in October 1947, it's time to draw a sponge over the past. And once he said that, that was it. And by about 1948, it died out and it went. And that was the end of that. However, the Holocaust took place, and the majority of all the extermination camps and the severity of it was in the East. And a lot of that would not have been possible without the assistance of the indigenous populations, particularly Latvia, Belarus, and Lithuania. These guys from these countries helped the Nazis in the Holocaust. And when the Russians started working towards Germany, 42 onwards, after Stalingrad, etc., these guys cleared off with the Germans towards Germany, disappeared, and ended up joining one of the Polish regiments or whatever. So they were stuck. In 1945, a lot of these guys had done the murders for the Nazis. Where do they go? Go back to Russia or go back to Latvia or whatever. They get topped. So they came to England. And we had a policy here where pretty much we let most people in. They got interviewed briefly at the customs or the equivalent immigration, told a few lies, yep, in they came. In they came. Now, the Russians knew a lot of these guys and sent extradition requests, but we ignored it. No, we don't deal with them, they're Russian. But this sort of carried on a bit. And in 1986, October 86, a Jewish Israeli investigator by the name of Ephraim Zurov, and John and I both know, sent a list of 17 Eastern European Nazis who were living in Great Britain to the British Embassy or the Consulate General in Los Angeles. This went to the Commons, ignored, but Greville Jenner I mentioned earlier, MP for Leicester East, he got hold of this and thought, we'll do something about this. And he did, he pushed it, and he formed, and he did a great job, an all-party group of war crimes all-party group, headed by Merlin Rees, former Labour cabinet minister, who was one of the MPs who was respected on both sides of the House. Douglas Hurd was Home Secretary, he was given a nudge, and they formed, and a report was also done correspondingly by Sir Thomas Hetherington and William Chalmers. Hetherington was the former DFPP, Chalmers was the former Crown Agent in Scotland. They were the top guys in their field on their day, and they produced a brilliant report on war crimes. And one of the recommendations was that there should be legislation to prosecute these people for murder. Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. Finchley was her constituency. She was in favour of it, got pushed through. The Parliament Act, which was used every now and then when the Lords object, as they did, the Parliament Act was used and it became legislation in May 1991. Just before that, a war crimes team was suggested to be put together from the Metropolitan Police and from Scotland. And this squad, I got to say that when I didn't know anything about this squad, I was a detective sergeant at the time. I didn't know anything about it. And I had dinner with a few friends of mine. And we were all three at the same station as sergeants. One became a deputy chief constable, and one became a detective chief superintendent. She was a lady. I'm not going to say their names. The three of us did not know this unit existed. The normal process for squads in the Metropolitan Police is orders that come out, like the army, twice a week, with all the bits and pieces like someone who's died, promoted, and anyone who wants to join a unit, like dogs or so on, then the advert's there, do this, do that. This wasn't ever done. It was done on the old PALS Act. I spoke to several of these guys who I knew when I was doing my research, relatively recently. Not one of them had read the excellent report produced for the Hetherington Chalmers report for Parliament, which was a great report and really explained the circumstances. And there's a book by the late David Cesarani, who was my PhD supervisor. He wrote a book called Justice Delayed, which I recommend to anyone who wants to know more about this. And he surprised the circumstances, just as I have there. Hence the reason why he asked me to do my doctorate. None of them had even heard of it, let alone read it. Consequently, they started off. I'm not going to go much more because it's John's part really, because he dealt with it far more extremely than I did. Suffice to say that there was no Jewish officers on the team. They didn't want Jewish officers on it. There were units set up in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. They had very little liaison with them initially. And I did suggest to them, did you ever speak to some of the old investigators, such as Jana, who were about, this is 1990, these guys were in their mid-60s to 70, my age, because they will give you some background of the circumstances, the difficulties you'd had. Not one of them had. Consequently, the war crimes team started their investigation. I'll now pass you over to John. Thank you.
Right. Well, good evening, everybody. Nice to see you here and online. Bob's taken the story up to 1991. War Crimes Unit, as he said, was formed at Scotland Yard. And one of the questions that prompted our research for the book was that in 1991, there were 274 potential suspects identified by the police in England and Wales, and 17 in Scotland. So if you do the maths, that's 291 people. And at the end of the war crimes process, which took 8 years, only one person was convicted. 2 people were prosecuted. One never got to a full trial because he had Alzheimer's, and only one was convicted. And we wanted to know, how was it that out of that huge number of people, we only achieved one conviction? And the second question, which was perhaps even more intriguing, was who were some of the other people who weren't prosecuted? What was the evidence against them? How strong was it? And why weren't they prosecuted? What were the criteria used by the Crown Prosecution Service to decide whether they should be prosecuted or not? And I'm going to try and show you a short television report that I did for the BBC at the time. I'm going to share screen, hopefully. And then it's Alt and delete and tab. Alt, tab. Right. Where? Yeah. Why can I not find the film that was there? Just make over to but it's not there. It was there earlier on, but is it? Well, if you can find it. As I play again. The best laid plans.
Well, indeed, it's just vanished.
Yeah.
There goes, folks. Oh, just now, then it just disappeared. Okay, we skip sharing screen now. Go to the
Oh, there's the actual file there. I think this is steam powered. This.
What's it? Anthony Sawoniuk is 76 and lives in a one-bedroom flat in East London. He's been under investigation by Scotland Yard for more than 2 years. When we tried to question him about his past, he became very agitated.
Paperwork, because I put a brick on you. All right? Sorry? You put it...
Although we didn't pursue him, Sawoniuk went to find a weapon. He returned with a lump of rusting metal. We were forced to move swiftly away. This is where the alleged crimes took place, the small town of Demarchovo in the southwest of Belarus. In 1941, when the Germans invaded, Sawoniuk was the deputy commander of police. Fyodor Zan has lived here all his life and was at school with Sawoniuk. Scotland Yard have told him that he'll be a witness if there's a trial in England. He took me to a mass grave in the forest and explained how, while hiding, he saw Sawoniuk kill a group of Jewish women in cold blood.
He told them to get undressed and said, "Put your clothes over there." He made them lie on the ground with their faces down. Then they were all machine gunned.
In 1941, there were 4,000 Jews living in the area. Within 18 months, all but a handful had been slaughtered by the Germans and local collaborators. Ivan Baglai has been interviewed as an eyewitness several times by war crimes detectives. He's also agreed to give evidence in England.
Sawoniuk was known to everyone, in all the villages. He killed Russians as well as Jews. Yes, he was known as the cruelest killer in the police force.
This is testimony from one of the few Jewish survivors who lives in Israel. This evidence too will be put forward at a trial. Sawoniuk's solicitor said his client strenuously denied the allegations and pointed out that he'd voluntarily been interviewed by the police. But in Demarchovo, hundreds of bodies, men, women and children, lie in a mass grave, and more than 20 witnesses will say Sawoniuk was responsible for many of the deaths. This is one of the forgotten killing grounds of Europe, but for some the horrors of the Nazi occupation are still fresh. Now they're waiting to see if, improbably, their story will be told in an English courtroom. Jon Silverman, BBC News, Demarchovo in Belarus.
Right. That piece ran on the main evening news in September 1997. And Sawoniuk was charged about 2.5 weeks later. And he stood trial in 1999 and was convicted. And what's interesting is that Sawoniuk's name was on a list supplied by the Soviet embassy to the Foreign Office in this country in 1988. And it was pure serendipity that he was ever found, because the name was spelt in the Russian way, Sawoniuk. And when the police came to look for him in this country, they did what they tend to do in many missing persons case. They put the first 3 letters of the name into various government databases, like the old DHSS, Ministry of Pensions and so on. So they put SAV in, and they could not find a match anywhere. And in 1992, they were prepared to give up. They told the Crown Prosecution Service, "We can't find him." And it was only when one of the historians who belatedly was working on the case, because initially, as Bob said, there were other Commonwealth inquiries going on, war crimes inquiries. And one of the key historians was attached to the Australian inquiry until late 1992, a man called Martin Dean. And it was only when he was working in the Stasi archive in Berlin, he came across a name that seemed to match all of the profile and the biographical details of this man Sawoniuk. and it was spelt in the Ukrainian Polish way, Sawoniuk. And when the police put SAW into the database, they found that he was living in London in the same house he'd been in since 1975 in Southwark. And they went to see him straight away. And that's an example, I suppose, of the kind of serendipity involved in many of these inquiries. Now, as I said, what intrigued us was not the case that came to a full trial, because this was widely reported in the media at the time. And what made the trial unique was that for the first and only time, a British criminal jury from the Old Bailey went to the scene of the alleged crimes. That forest that I showed in the report there, I went with, and the jury trudged around this forest in Belarus in the middle of February, looking at where that witness, Fedor Zan, said he had stood when he saw Sawoniuk kill the 15 Jewish women. And they decided that, you know, he was telling the truth. But it was some of the other cases that we looked into where we wondered why they weren't prosecuted as well. And I'll just give you two. There are a number that I could mention, but I mean, time doesn't allow. There's a man called Haris Svikeris, a Latvian who lived in Milton Keynes. And for some time, he was thought by the police to have been the strongest case for the first prosecution. He was a senior battalion commander in a notorious outfit called the Arras Commando. And if you look at the history books of Eastern Europe during the Second World War, you will find many, many references to the Arras Commando, named after its leader, Victor Arras, who was subsequently, he escaped after the war, went to Germany, but eventually was arrested in the 1970s and sentenced to life imprisonment. Now, this man, Svikeris, was so senior that on occasions he deputized for Arras when he was away. And I just want to read you a quote from the book. The head of Scotland Yard's War Crimes Unit, a man called Chief Superintendent Eddie Bathgate, shortly after he retired, I spoke to him. And he said to me, Svikeris was a powerful case, and I would cheerfully have put him on the charge sheet. The more the War Crimes Unit investigated him, the stronger the case got. There was no dispute about identification. He was a volunteer and admitted during the interviews that he was present when massacres took place, without an actual confession of guilt. Svikeris was not prosecuted. I'll just deal with another case before I tell you why neither of these two people were prosecuted. And this was a man who achieved some notoriety at the time in Scotland, a man called Antanas Gekas, who was a Lithuanian. And he was also a senior commander in a Lithuanian police battalion that was absolutely notorious for the massacres that it committed in Eastern Europe, particularly in Belarus during the Second World War. And Gekas, who had worked for the National Coal Board in Edinburgh, was a man who was well aware of his own sort of self-importance, decided to sue a couple of media outlets. Scottish television, to their credit, did a couple of very powerful documentaries about Gekas, late 1980s, about 1990. And Gekas very unwisely decided to sue for defamation. And he lost. And the judge at his trial, Lord Justice Milligan, said he was clearly satisfied that Gekas was a war criminal. And I'll read you another short quote from the book about Gekas, given by one of his own platoon officers who said he was interviewed for that documentary by Scottish television. He said his direct commander was Gekas, although at that time he was known as Gesavicius, that was his original Lithuanian name. He stood on the edge of the pit and gave the order to fire. After executions, he would check the pits and finish off anyone still alive with his pistol. The corpses were 1.5 meters deep. This was a massacre that took place in a town called Sluts in Belarus, which was actually mentioned during the Nuremberg tribunals because it was so notorious for the brutality inflicted by the Nazis and their local collaborators. So the question is, why were Gekas and Sfikeris and a number of other people whose stories you can find in the book not prosecuted? Now, you might think, well, 56, 57 years after the war, the evidence would obviously be hard to find. Witnesses would either be dead or infirm, their memories might be unreliable. But actually, the significant factor was the criteria imposed by the Crown Prosecution Service, and above them, senior lawyers known as Treasury Counsel. Treasury Counsel are advisors to the Attorney General, and they advise whether the evidence in certain very, very serious cases, like war crimes, should actually be prosecuted. And senior counsel decided that they would not prosecute any case where the victims were not Jews. And that's an interesting criterion to impose, because there's nothing in the War Crimes Act itself that says anything about the ethnic identity of the victims. And in fact, I can't think of any piece of legislation in English law which actually says we will only prosecute cases in order to benefit one ethnic group or another. And many of the people that we mention in the book murdered many people that were not Jews in Belarus and some of the other countries in Eastern Europe. But the lawyers decided that they wouldn't prosecute cases where people were not Jewish, because they thought, this was for a very transactional reason actually, they thought that the defense might be able to argue that they were associated with the partisans, and therefore they would have a stronger defense than clearly unarmed and vulnerable Jewish men, women, and children. Another criterion that actually restricted the number of prosecutions was that they were only interested in prosecuting cases where the defendant was in some sort of position of command. You'll be aware, at the Nuremberg tribunals, the defense that I was only obeying orders, that my commanding officer told me to do X, Y, and Z, was blown out of the water in 1945. And yet the lawyers decided that in order to make the number of prosecutions, I think, manageable, they would only look at cases where people had some direct responsibility for subordinates. As it happens, Sawoniuk, the only person who was actually successfully prosecuted, hardly qualified as a commander. His own lawyer said, and quote is in the book, that he had the status of a desk sergeant in an English provincial police station. He wasn't actually a commander, but he did have one or two other people under him. He was prosecuted. I mentioned at the beginning that one other person was prosecuted, but never actually stood a full trial. And it's an interesting case, a man called Serafinovich. He was prosecuted in 1995. Again, it was a case that I investigated, and he was actually arrested the night that my report went out on the BBC 9 o'clock news, as it was in those days. He was arrested 3 hours later. The report that Bob mentioned, the Hetherington-Chalmers report, which recommended the change in the law, recognized that if anyone was going to be prosecuted, they would obviously be very elderly by this point. The witnesses would be elderly, would have to come from many other countries in the world, might well be infirm, and therefore infirm. Speed was of the essence. Once somebody had been prosecuted, they said the trial should happen as quickly as possible. And they recommended that a procedure which was known as the committal trial, where the evidence was tested before a senior magistrate before going on to the Old Bailey, that should be done away with in order to speed up the process. Now, had that happened in the Serafinovich case, he was considerably older than Sawoniuk. Sawoniuk was 76 when he was first arrested. Serafinovich was 83, but he was in perfectly good health. And I quote in the book from his police interview, because I've got the video of his first couple of interviews by the police. And he's clearly in full possession of his faculties. There's no doubt about that. And the lawyers agree. But because they did not implement this recommendation in the Hetherington-Chalmers report and went through a whole committal process, in effect, a trial before a trial, which took 6 weeks, with witnesses coming from all over the world. And then there was what was known as an abuse of process challenge, where the defense later tried to get the whole case knocked out. By the time Serafinovich actually stood trial at the Old Bailey at the beginning of 1997, he was already suffering from Alzheimer's disease. And it was clear that he wasn't mentally able to instruct his lawyers, and the case fell. So there are various other reasons why there were so few prosecutions. And of course, some of these cases could have been dealt with much earlier. Bob mentioned the extradition request made by the Soviet Union. And I found some Foreign Office documents. It was always assumed that if a request came in from the Soviet Union, it would be automatically rejected on the grounds that you couldn't possibly get a fair trial in the Soviet Union. In fact, the documents show that in 1 or 2 of these cases, there was a lot of agonized discussion amongst officials about they wanted to hold the line that nobody would be extradited to the Soviet Union, but they recognized that some of these people were clearly war criminals. And you can see interchanges between some of these officials in one particular case, a man who lived in Bolton, as to whether they should do some inquiries about, was this man an egregious war criminal, as the Soviets alleged? And they thought, well, no, because if we do it in this case, we'll be duty bound to look at other cases. So they actually sat on their hands and did nothing. But the man was an egregious war criminal. And final point, Serafinovich, who I've just mentioned, the man who was the first to be prosecuted but never stood a full trial, he first came to the attention of the authorities in this country in 1947, when a member of his own unit, he came here claiming to be Polish. In fact, he was from Belarus. Member of his own unit alleged that he was a war criminal and had committed crimes in Belarus. And he was investigated by a very senior officer, what was known as the London Cage, where very high-level Nazis were interrogated after the war. And they decided that, well, maybe the man making the alley grudge, he's here as a Pole, We won't really go too deeply into this case. He's obviously a fairly low-level figure. But I mean, had they taken the allegations really seriously and gone thoroughly into his background, they would have found that he was actually a much more senior and influential figure than Sawoniuk, who was eventually convicted, a man who was a Belarusian nationalist, very close to the wartime nationalist leader of Belarus. And he could have been deported back in 1947 when he was a man of about 32, instead of appearing as a shambling figure of 85 at the Old Bailey in 1997. So it's a kind of emblematic, I think, of the mistakes over the years, which enabled several hundred Eastern Europeans to come to this country, not all of them obviously having committed war crimes, but a number of whom clearly did, and lived out their lives here, having taken part, and an important part, because they were the eyes and ears in Eastern Europe of the Nazis. The Einsatzgruppen, the Nazi killing units, they didn't know who were Jews and who weren't Jews. They weren't from the area. They relied on the local police collaborators, the Schutzmannschaften as they were known, to actually point them out and help hunt them down. So nobody should be under any illusions that they didn't play their own significant role in the Holocaust. I'll leave it there so that if anybody wants to ask any questions, then we're more than happy to answer them.
I've got one question.
Hang on.
Thank you very much, John and Bob, for that, what was a harrowing description and details of the last the years since the Second World War and the UK war crimes trials that were permitted in 1991. I'm sure there are questions to be asked here this evening. You said Sawoniuk and Gaykas. Do we know that no Jews were murdered by them and therefore they were not prosecuted, or had they been responsible for the deaths of Jews and that was ignored in order to exonerate them because they were killing others and not Jews?
No. I mean, the reason that they were not prosecuted actually was both of them, both Sawoniuk and Gaykas, committed many murders against the Jewish civilian population in Belarus. What the Crown Prosecution Service and Treasury Council were looking for were at least two living eyewitnesses who would appear in court and give testimony under cross-examination. And that was the stumbling block.
I see.
That they could not find two people, credible people, to come to court and testify against them. And that sort of begs the question, they treated these cases as normative murder prosecutions. Normally in a murder prosecution, you would require eyewitnesses and you would expect the defense to have a chance to cross-examine them in open court. But these were cases, obviously, of people, who had committed crimes half a century before. And that was a very tall order. And that was where both those cases fell down.
Yes.
Yes.
Imka.
Okay, just one question. Have you got a list of all these people that were under suspicion? Have you got the names?
Do you have a list of all the suspects who are?
Well, I mean, if you buy the book, you'll see a number of other cases which we go into in detail. I don't know every single name.
No, and also from the Second World War as well. As John says, there's a number of investigations I covered in the Second World War, post-Second World War, one or two significant ones, and John did much the same with his inquiries with the BBC in the 1990s.
Specifically, why I'm asking.
Please do.
Your surname, Smith's Latvian national.
Smith.
Latvian national. I know he died in Bath.
Right.
He died in Britain, I know that.
Yeah.
I can't remember the question.
No.
I don't know that name. I mean, I haven't heard it. As I say, one of the problems, of course, is that even 30 years later, I mean, the War Crimes Unit, actually, it's interesting that we're speaking here in this location, because for the last few years of its life, Scotland Yard's War Crimes Unit was housed round the corner in Leman Street. But anyway, that's by the by. But even now, after all these years, the files on all of these people at the National Records Office in Kew are still closed. And the names, other than those that seeped into the papers at the time, have never been formally released, and there was no end of inquiry report, unlike many of the other Commonwealth countries which did reports. So the whole thing has been, shrouded in secrecy and under the radar.
In fact, at the end of the Second World War, when the War Crimes team sort of fizzled out because of the Russian situation, there wasn't a report done at all about the UK War Crimes team, whereas the Americans did a very comprehensive report, which was the basis they used ultimately when they reformed several years later. Similarly, as John rightly points out, the Canadians still do an annual, not so much annual now, but they were doing annual reports on the progress. The Australians did a very extensive report. Both of you and I have read that, John. We know the bloke who wrote it. And the New Zealanders did a report. The Scots did a report which was sanitised to almost worthless use. But we had nothing whatsoever. And I actually asked that of the guy who ran the unit. I got to know because I've been in the police. And he said, oh, we did a report on every case. Yeah, every case has a report attached to it, obviously. But overall, nothing at all. He said, we never asked to. So again, that will be of such use to historians and used should anything reoccur elsewhere, which it could do in this modern world of ours. What a great thing to work from. Nothing at all. Disappointing.
Thank you. Mark?
There was one online one, I think, but I saw a name flash up. But anyway.
Imo will.
Yeah.
This question is more sport. Notice that they didn't get the name right, Sawoniuk. Isn't it the case, if you want to be a bit of a devil's advocate, that the English view of these countries, of the whole belt between Poland and Russia, was that it was just beyond comprehension? And whenever you go there now, to Ukraine, to Lithuania, to Poland, people just don't talk. There's this amazing sort of denial. It's very hard to get a straight story out of people, even now. And so I have got some sympathy for people who think it's just that was in another country, and not being able to deal with those people. They're just sort of impenetrable. And also the people who accuse Sawoniuk and saw what he did, you very often might end up wondering whether they were implicated. It's very, very difficult to understand quite what's going on and what went on, just as it is when you go to Germany, or the 1960s and 70s when I did. There's just this numbness and inability to share anything in a sensible or comprehensible way.
Yeah, I don't think that's not a reason why many of these cases weren't prosecuted, because the evidence, one of the interesting things is that even before the war had ended, the forerunner of the KGB, the NKVD, Stalin set up what was known as an extraordinary state commission to investigate all of the crimes which had taken place on Soviet soil. And they sent in teams of investigators from the NKVD to every town, village, and hamlet where the crimes had taken place. And they produced an extraordinary treasure trove of evidence, all of which was contemporaneous, because they interviewed witnesses in villages where the Germans had only recently retreated. And all of this information was accurate. It was used subsequently in a number of cases in America, and they never found any single example from the Soviet Union where evidence had been doctored or where they couldn't rely on the evidence. So there was an enormous amount of verifiable information available had we taken a different approach, I think, to material coming out of the Soviet Union. And had we decided at the end of the war that maybe we should look more closely at, I mean, about 200,000 Eastern Europeans came to this country at the end of the war, mainly to work in heavy industry. And there was no kind of scrutiny about their background until 1950. Belatedly, there was a thing called Operation Post Report under MI5 to look into these people. And ostensibly, it was to try and root out people who had been Nazis or Nazi collaborators. But in fact, by 1950, of course, as Bob said, the Cold War was in full flow, and they were really only looking for communists. And the only people flagged up were people that they suspected of being pro-Soviet. So it was a fig leaf, and, you know, they were not looked at with any kind of serious intent until the whole thing erupted again, as Bob said, in the 1980s.
Any other questions? Yes, Cameron. We might get that horrible echo again. Why don't you just give us the question?
Just probably hear you, but
I can't find the pause button.
Very simple question. Given the enormous amount of money which must have been required for these investigations and the personnel involved, and then in the end, only one person actually being prosecuted, is there any evidence that government legal profession have reviewed actually what transpired, and if we were to face similar situation in the future, that things would have to be done very differently?
I can answer that, John. I did a freedom of information. Yes, of course. Effectively, was there an inquiry into the inquiries and the amount of money involved? And if there was an inquiry, maybe that would assist to do things differently in the future. Is that right, Cameron?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I did a freedom of information request on the cost, and it was £11 million. That cost. And something I pointed out, I did research in the police world. You get budgets, all companies do, and as a senior officer, I had to keep within my budget, or else I get a telling off from someone. This unit was run home office finance, so there wasn't any control over it. So the guys could pretty much weren't restricted to what they could do or where they could go, and they did, and they used it, and they spent a lot of money, £11 million back in the 90s. It was a lot of money. Had there been a report, which John and I mentioned, and there wasn't, on the whole inquiry from start to finish, that's exactly what I suggested earlier, could be used to say, right, should this happen again, we may have to do the similar thing with different wars. Second World War, there's not many people left from it actively, but then that will be a useful guide to future. So it's a very fair question, and there wasn't, and there should have been. Does that answer that, Cameron? Okay, thank you.
I mean, just as a quick corollary, one can only speculate as to why there wasn't, because it's a perfectly reasonable question. Why wasn't there some sort of review of what had gone on, and why only one person was convicted? And one can speculate that the legal profession generally, I mean, if you look at a breakdown of the debates in the House of Commons and the Lords when the War Crimes Bill was being debated, you will find that most of the opposition came from lawyers. Not all lawyers, including, I mean, the man who was Britain's chief prosecutor at the time of the Nuremberg tribunals, Shawcross, who had been Attorney General in 1945, but he was deeply opposed to the War Crimes Bill. And I think Bob mentioned Churchill's famous remark that by 1948, we should draw a sponge across the past. And I think the legal profession generally, and this is a broad brush assessment, generally took the view that if these people hadn't been prosecuted at the end of the war, then we should let sleeping dogs lie. We're probably only going to catch fairly small fry, and I would contest that there were small fry. So there wasn't any great incentive, I think, to look at why the whole process had not been successful.
I can add to that. We are still arresting people, the police are, for old murders 40, 50 years ago, and they've been reinvestigated, and a small amount of DNA evidence is discovered, and people in their 60s and 70s and 80s are being prosecuted. And some of those cases are a lot longer than the gap here. So the answer is that, yes, we should have done it.
Yeah.
Thank you. I suppose a lot of people do remember the Sawoniuk arrest and conviction, and in a sense that sort of sated the appetite for retribution in the past. And if there had been hundreds of people arrested, and well, not hundreds, obviously, it was 291 was on the list, but if there had been lots more, it could have reflected badly on ourselves, and we thought, oh dear, we're harboring all these criminals. But one managed to stave off any sense that we were harboring lots of terrible people here. Interesting too, I suppose, that Sawoniuk, it's not so far V and W. I'm surprised that they hadn't already tried that. You know, an alternative spelling of a East European name, although the Russian spelling, the Cyrillic script, would have obscured some of that also.
Well, it shows you the the importance of the history. There were two historians who eventually were working in with the war crimes police. Yeah. One was a fluent Russian speaker, and the one I mentioned, Martin Dean, was fluent in German.
Yes.
But until that point, as Bob pointed out, you had a whole collection of randomly assembled police officers, none of whom could speak any of the languages.
Yes.
Relying on their expertise as police investigators. But, when the police investigate a murder, they've got a body, and then they work towards trying to find a name. Here, they were working backwards. They had a name, and then they were trying to work back to linking them to crimes. So it was a hopeless task, really, until the historians came on board.
Yeah. Well, once again, thank you very much, John and Bob. I'm sure there may be other questions here that we could put to you over a glass of wine and piece of cake at in the vestry of this church, which is the normal conclusion to one of these monthly talks. So the law's delay, as Shakespeare has it in Hamlet, is one of the terrible things that we have to put up with in life, and crimes not being investigated, and people, in a sense, getting away with what they've done in the past. You only have to wait a certain number of years and it all gets forgotten and we continue. Anyway, let's conclude there. Thank you all very much once again for coming here live to St. George's Church, and also to those people who came via Zoom present here. And let's thank you now and give John and Bob a round of applause for their.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Hank, the book is on sale in the foyer, and that's got copies of the book in the foyer there.
I should have said that.
Yes, sorry, that's quite right, Rick. It was up there. It's called
Safe Haven
Safe
is the
Haven.
name of the book, the UK's investigation into Nazi collaborators and the failure of justice. So,
thank you.
Here we are. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Please join us
Yeah,
for a glass
thank you.
at the back.
Thank you for coming.
Wasn't so big, much better. You come out and you're away.
I was up there anyway. I volunteered in from the Hall Museum one day.
And you were there.
In fact, Philip Sands is doing sort of museum.
I heard you saying earlier.
60 people.